Hi Marlies. We're doing a second round because the first one didn't go live, but welcome.
Thank you so much for having me in your wonderful studio, and pleasure to finally maybe reach you all. My name is Marlies, I'm a curator at MUMOK Vienna. I'm very happy that Andreas FOGARASI invited me to do this virtual studio tour with him. And we can see a lot of current and upcoming projects, a lot of material already all around us. And I'm looking forward to asking some of those curious questions to you. Right on.
This is the space where I enter the studio and where I put heavy things when I bring them. So I have parts of buildings, I will explain later why, but this is a window from a building in Budapest. These are parts of the Wien Museum in Vienna.
Oh, nice, okay.
There are all kinds of... This is from an office building in the first district of Franz Josefsky, a granite slab with a panel with graffiti on it, which I like very much. This is a facade panel, glass, all this kind of stuff. And this is a finished work that looks a little bit different.
It is. It's a new one, right?
Yes.
What is it? What has it been?
So actually the project we are talking about here, why I will show you more, but I have a lot of stuff like that piling up. For a long time in my work I was documenting urban change. I was photographing, filming, architecture, public space, and more the surfaces and materiality of buildings. And a while ago I realized, or I started a project that would take this documentary aspect further and become more physical in the way that I collect parts of buildings that are being demolished, mostly in Vienna. I did a bigger exhibition about that in Vienna at Kunsthalle Wien.
Yeah, the 9 buildings stripped. That was just a recent fantastic one.
That's kind of the title that has like even 2 hints to nods to Ed Ruscha.
Absolutely.
So I collect parts of buildings that are being demolished and combine them with the material of the new building that goes there instead. And I bind them together with this steel strap that we know from large
packaging or like containers or shipments.
And kind of make these packages of different time layers. So the facade we see here in the back is from Klapper in Vienna, which was a large fashion store on Favoritenstraße that was standing empty for some years now and was demolished around Christmas last year. And it was quite a long process to get these parts, and I'm very happy that I managed, because I wrote to the owner very early on, and it was, I didn't really get a response. And then when they started demolishing, I just went there like 5 times to the building site, and at some point, they agreed to put some parts aside. So what we have here is a facade from 1970, and it is strapped together again with an aluminium facade with dots from 2020. So we have this different, and you see the materiality, you see also how aesthetics is connected to time.
Yeah, how aesthetics are changing, and maybe as we move along, I think these material samples are quite lovely actually. And you took these buildings, and maybe you can tell us also more of which buildings those were, for example in the exhibition in the Kunsthalle Wien, and made portraits of them, as you say. So,
well, this process of doing the exhibition for Kunsthalle was quite a long one, and it still continues, and it will be an ongoing project for the years to come. There are many things that I saw that are being demolished, and I could get something, and that's the easiest. Some things I know I'm interested in, but they're still standing, and you could hope that they remain. I prefer things to remain, but if they, I'm ready. And for some things I was too late. And one of the buildings that I was too late for, and that was very important for me, was the Südbahnhof in Vienna that was demolished 10 years ago. And I remember standing in the hall of Südbahnhof. It was already empty, and there was a red marble pillars, and there was this wonderful terrazzo floor. And I thought it would be nice to save some of that, but I didn't have storage, a studio, a project. So I didn't do anything. And then 10 years later, it was really hard to find somebody, but I did find somebody who, for example, this is a small version of the work about Südbahnhof with an original floorboard or a floor tile, a terrazzo floor tile from the 1950s Südbahnhof, and it's packaged together with a larger, again, a floor marble panel from the new Hauptbahnhof that was erected there instead. And there's a bigger version of the work, a two-part, like with red marble and the materials of the new building.
Yeah, most beautiful one, which I can proudly say that it recently joined the MUMOK collection, Department of Contemporary Art, and very happy to have that because it's so special and yeah, a memorial basically to a building that we all came to like and miss since it was changed. But that's how urban structures change, basically. And I think you always kept little souvenirs from some buildings, and you made also these little sketches that we also showed at MUMOK earlier. But the Kunsthalle Wien exhibition was basically also your first project dealing with Vienna as a city that you live in, that you work in, that you were born in and raised in, but also the larger works actually, quite spatial.
Yeah.
And
this, as I said, my first works dealing with these topics were very immaterial. You know, there were videos and photography, but I always, you know, sometimes you pick up a tile, and it's a souvenir. And it took me many years to figure out a way to create works out of this notion of materiality that is not just a souvenir and it's not just nostalgic. And for me, it's really important to not just show the old one, but to have the new one instead, because it really, it's, you know, I try to understand the world. And And my way to understanding the world is by juxtaposing different levels of time. People often think that my work is all about architecture. I think in more general terms, it's about cultural artifacts or about the role of culture in society. And architecture, you know, it's the biggest one and the most durable one. So sometimes it's easy to look at that. You know, it's where creativity and artistic freedom and power, you know, financial power meet. Yeah, so it's, you know, there's a lot of tension.
But also it's a lot of level of abstraction. I mean, there we have a wonderful exemplar as well. For the viewers, which building is that, by the way?
Actually, this was after I finished the 9 buildings for Kunsthalle. I had some parts left, and I made it's a remix. It's a remix. It's a sampler. It's also a little teaser because this was not shown in the exhibition space itself, but in a vitrine that the Kunsthalle rents in the Opernpassage. In the subway, so it was more, normally they put their posters there. And then instead of a poster, I put the real work. And it's parts from, the window is from Rinterzelt, you know, a recycling facility that was demolished 2 years ago. The floor panel, I mean, this Pirelli rubber floor is from an office building on Franz Josefs Quay. This new facade panel is from the Sozialversicherung, the social insurance for freelancers, SVS on Wiener Hauptstraße.
So it's really a condensed kind of version of demolished and new buildings in Vienna, which is quite nice as the idea of a poster for the exhibition. But also when you're planning the show, I mean, I quite love the model. Do you often work with models when you have exhibitions actually? Or always, or
I almost always, So this is the model of the Kunsthalle Karlsplatz, which is funny because only when you build it you realize how long it is.
It is indeed.
Because it has one glass facade, so usually, you know, it opens up. You know, the Karlsplatz is part of the exhibition space, and that's why it was really my number one choice or my ideal space for this exhibition.
It was perfect.
That relates to the city.
Yeah, inside and outside, as do your works in this case.
So it's really like, half of it is in the space and half of it is just looking out and, you know, looking at the city, maybe in a different way. And I always build models, always in the same scale, 1:25, which I know now already very well. So sometimes it's enough to just build the model and I already know what can fit there, how I can deal with it. And 1:25 is a scale where you don't really do all the details of the works, but you can already, you know, show how volumes and surfaces interact in the space. This is a model of one of the works in a bigger scale. This is really a model of the work, while this is just, you know.
I remember that one. It came into the space. And
But just one more thing. Actually, I think that all my works are models in a way. You know, some of them are one-to-one models, but they're not the real thing. Yeah. You know, I make hybrid mixes of what surrounds us, and it's not that. Yeah. You know, there's some kind of abstraction, and that abstraction is the model.
And I think that makes so much sense to speak about the world in ways of models. You cannot always look at the real thing and discuss it, but through art it's a lens, and through the model you can say it's an exemplary gaze that you can have, and the level of abstraction is crucial. To also not be in this nostalgic train, as you mentioned, but more in a progressive and critical way.
I think even my films, you know, my videos, they're not really films or videos, they're like models of films, you know. They're mimicking the effects and the possibilities we have. But, you know, there's something wrong with them, and maybe because they're not, you know, they're not actual films.
Just an unrelated question. What is this about with the Stadt Wien logo? And we have the elections coming up. I was wondering what's going on.
This is a really old work. It's from 2004.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And it was published in Malmö, which still exists, a free newspaper. And for a long time I was collecting and researching the public, like, logos and like the corporate identity of places.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because another thing I could say about my work is that it's about places. You know? It's portraits of places and, you know, or landscapes or something. And this, you know, was a very abstracted notion of the landscape of a city, which is the logo. You know, and these are the two logos of Vienna. One is the logo of the city administration, and the other one is the tourist logo.
Sure.
And that was 15 years ago, and I made a new one because both logos were changed. The tourism logo was changed maybe 6 or 7 years ago. The logo of the city of Vienna maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, now forever, true. Yeah.
So it's just, and I think it's called Inside Outside, because one is for the citizens that are part of this city, and the other one is for the consumers, the tourists
that
who come to pay.
That makes so much sense now. Thanks for explaining that. And currently, actually, you have a project on view in your Hungarian gallery, Vintage Galleria, who is also hosting the YouTube video, thankfully, for Frieze Art Talks now. And you have some of those works, and you were concerned with the Hungarian workers' movement, where you bought some vintage prints and graphics, and you show also together with Christian Cosmas Meyer in a larger topical theme. So maybe you want to tell us something about this current exhibition.
Well, for many years now, I was collecting and buying at auction prints, copperplate prints from the 60s and 70s, 60s mostly, in Hungary. So they're socialist realist prints, often depicting, you know, official topics like the history of the workers' movement, or, you know, railway stations and telegraph towers and highway overpasses and stuff like that. There was a kind of gallery or art system in Hungary where artists who were not, you know, openly against the government, they would be commissioned for works that were then bought, or these prints were commissioned to be sold, you know, and then they would be hanging in factories and in homes and in offices. And I was interested in this. Actually, I was interested in two of the artists who were in this system. One is Dora Maurer, the other one is János Major, who were always, apart from their free work, were doing this commission. They were both very good at you know, copper engraving, and they were really like masters of this technique, and this earned them an income. And I think as artists, you know, we always have this, let's call it a problem.
Or the struggle, you know, the struggle is real, as we say.
That, you know, there's your work and there's your life. And your work ideally sustains your life, but there are some ambivalent situations that come with that. Some are teaching, some are selling really well in the art market, and many are in between or outside. So, like all my works that are showing something from the past, I think it's a very current topic that I'm bringing up. So what I did here, the first idea was just to after I had all these works and I really enjoyed them, and I thought it would be nice to exhibit them, and then you need a frame and you need a context, and then I started to develop these frames out of copper. I've been working with copper before. I was doing these folded objects from copper that are a little bit like roofs and a little bit like books or like paper objects, and a little bit like material samples. They usually have roughly this size. And then I developed these, I call them envelopes, so they're not envelopes, but they envelop the work. It's like one plate that is folded around the work, and it's displaying it but also concealing it. If you go really close, you can see the work like properly, but from the distance you just see this star. And it's something that's at the same time like celebrating the work of these artists. It's a period in Hungarian art history, or I think in art history of most Eastern European countries, that is not part of the canon anymore.
Yeah.
Of course, after 1989, all the unofficial artists of the 60s and 70s, their life works was rediscovered or discovered. They entered the collections of museums, and the official stuff that was already in the museums disappeared somehow. And these prints, they were printed in high numbers, but most of them, many were just thrown out.
And maybe even though they were not freely made but commissioned, I think they are still a very good like Zeugnis or like a memorial of those times. And we can see, you said about protests and demonstrations, and then again that connects very clearly to today and nowadays, and the demonstrations that are held all over the world for different matters, be it good ones like Black Lives Matter or anti-mask wearing, which is I'm not so fond of, obviously. And also in Hungary, I think when you were installing for the show, you were seeing or experiencing a protest, quite like contemporary one, which then I think relates very closely to this idea of how artists can tackle systems, or if they are part of it, but still, if their work can reflect on those times.
Yeah, the works I chose for the current exhibition at Vintage Galeria, they are all depictions of demonstrations throughout the history of the workers' movement, like from 1917 to 1930 to 1937, often very brutal fights between workers and the police or the military, that the 1960s Hungary claimed to be part of this history. And yes, they are very interesting because yes, they were commissioned by a dictatorial system, but they also show the emancipatory struggle of the masses, of the working class. And yes, at the time when in Budapest, there, and also elsewhere, but especially in Budapest, there are many reasons to demonstrate. Yeah. Just when I was there were demonstrations for the film and theatre school that had its autonomy taken away from the government. So there's even, precisely a question of the freedom of art and the freedom of science. And in these works in Vintage Gallery, you have people standing up, you have people fighting, you have people, dying and fighting for their causes.
Quite intense. Do you want to show us some more of those prints right now?
I have some like half ready ones here. This is from another series. It's a it's a telegraph. How would you call it? Eine Schaltzentrale. Where phone calls are being connected. A connection. I think here. I have scenes from factories. This is of course a cliché of socialist realism to show the working people.
But you have been collecting those for quite a while, right?
Yeah, I just looked it up. I started 8 years ago.
Okay.
But then I'm also interested in, there's the topic and there's the content of the work. But then there are also, there's full abstraction here.
Absolutely. And depiction of places and architectures where people work or demonstrate. I think that's again connecting to your interest in the city or architecture as a cultural or place of meaning rather than just being a material.
Yeah. Often they are showing places that don't exist anymore, they are being forgotten. And so there's always this kind of archaeological aspect in my work and one that's, I don't know.
And the question I think about social places of social gathering, of cultural production in a social context, is also a very recent project that just opened, Haus der Begegnung or House of Encounters here in Vienna. Maybe you want to tell us something about that.
So this is the model of a typographic intervention I did on the facade of a cultural center here in Vienna, which is related to the Volkshochschulen, so the
universities for the people.
Yeah, something like that, which is an old structure that goes back to the late 19th century.
Does the neighbor think you're too loud now? Okay. So this is in a socialist living structure called the Per Albin Hansen settlement here in Vienna. And I think you were saying you were invited to do that with Cur, with Art in Public Space, funded by the city of Vienna actually. And to draw attention to these kind of places that have been lost, because right now we are quite in a separated world of living socialist housing and institutional art making and cultural production. So these kinds of places are increasingly becoming more interesting yet again as we start to think about new terms of living together or creating our culture. Why were you interested in those actually? I mean, it ties to maybe, it's tied maybe to an older project actually of yours that's very important.
Yes, I was very happy about this project because it related back to a very early project of mine, which I did for the Hungarian pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2007, which was called Kultur und Freizeit, culture and, let's say, free time, actually is the best translation for it, for which I researched and filmed cultural houses in Hungary. The earliest ones were really coming out of the workers' movement from the 19th century, and then the socialist state in the 1950s, 60s and 70s built many of them throughout Hungary. And for the exhibition I chose 6 of them to portray them in like short video essays, and I created kind of projection space for them, a kind of black cube that was cut in half, where you would sit in the short side and the long side would be kind of a micro cinematic space. And like these 6 films, these 6 boxes were spread in the Hungarian pavilion in Venice. And at that time when I was doing that research and filming those houses, I also looked at the Viennese counterparts of these that were, as I mentioned, the Volkshochschulen. Like the People's University. The first one of the first ones was the Urania that we all know as a kind of place for educating people, self-educating people. So this is also a kind of important notion. That
educating adults, actually, not educating younger people, students as we know it when you enter university, but like adults who have been in their fields of work but want to learn something completely different.
Yeah, and I would say this is today maybe also a very important part of the Red Vienna that we still live in, although many of the things are diminishing, but it is part of a socialist city, and there are many relations in that way. And one of the buildings I visited back then is so some of these Volkshochschulen, they have a larger event hall. For theater and stuff like that, and they were called Haus der Begegnung, which is not their name anymore, but it used to be the name. And one of them was in the Per Albin Hansen Siedlung, and I revisited that place a while ago, and I saw that on this big facade, which is like attached to a big housing block, there are holes in the facade. And it took me a while to figure out that this was where an old sign, an old neon sign formerly said Haus der Begegnung. And I came up with this idea to reinstate that name for for the place and to again install a big neon sign spelling out that name. So I designed this slightly modernist typographic design that it's very, very large. It's like 7 meters high and 16 meters wide.
Okay.
And it's lit in the night. And I think it's a very telling name, you know, Haus der Begegnung. It sounds very old-fashioned, but of course it's also very easy to understand what it means or what it could mean.
It's simple and straightforward. So basically, you can encounter other people there. You can encounter culture there. It is a space that is public, which is increasingly, I think, important to speak about the use of public space in the cities, because most zones are privatized and tied to consuming things offered by a certain company. I think this is really tied, as you said, to the Red Vienna, and a really interesting concept of spending your free time.
And in a way, it's also, you know, public space, but also the role of culture in society. Mm-hmm. You know, it's, where was it? Culture.
Yeah,
no,
culture.
We work in culture, Marlies.
Yeah,
no?
we do actually, we do.
And it's fucked up.
It is indeed.
Because, you know, what does it mean, culture? When we say culture, we mean something else than, you know, in 1900, the people who founded like these adult education places, and we certainly mean something else than what the politician says when he says that, you know, culture is important.
For sure, and this has been a very hot topic, I think, right now, yet again, in looking at the state of the world, and also looking at culture should be in a much more broader sense. So people keep talking about sports and arts events and theatres, which is fine and certainly part of it. But if we look at culture as opposed to having no culture, it is actually an essential business. And this is something we may have relearned now through this corona crisis as well, that it's not just something we do once we have fed ourselves and have dry clothes, but culture ties us together as a society. It's very much about inclusion, in having established values, in looking at the world through different eyes. Thankfully, often through the help of artists, looking around the corner through their artworks at things that we encounter in our everyday lives. But if we just look at it in our everyday lives, we can't see all the dimensions that these topics have. And also culture, I think, has a lot to do with democracy, or like democratic processes and involvement and empowerment of the individual. So I think this the name actually House of Encounters, even though it's old school and I know it that it existed, I think we could bring that back in a meaningful way. And thankfully you now put us on fleek with that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this notion of culture, well, also in the title Kultur und Freizeit, and even in an even older work, which, you know, I just came out of art school when I started a project that was called Culture Park.
Yeah.
And which also kind of tried to understand the notion of culture and the commercialization of culture. Cultural industries is probably not the same.
No.
Museum, you know, there was all this wave of building museums to put post-industrial cities on the map.
Yeah, of course.
Which maybe Bilbao started. Yeah.
It's still being done.
Still, we have we have caricatures of art museums being built around the world. Now less, which is another problem. But so, you know, and we are somewhere in the middle, and sometimes we show at these places, and sometimes we help create these places. And still, the most important thing to address an audience is the most difficult one. And there are these very high-profile things like, culture capital of Europe, which is often, which is rarely about culture, but about tourism and infrastructure.
And selling the city to people. But speaking of high-profile cultural events, how about the Venice Biennale? Should we not remind our viewers that you have won the Golden Lion for your representation of Hungary back in the day, which is not your home country, but you have ties there, family bounds. You yourself are Austrian, Viennese. How did you go about this big challenge of representing a country that you know so much about, but not everything? And with this project you mentioned with Kultur und Freizeit?
Well, I have a Hungarian name, Fogarasi. I speak Hungarian with an accent. I was born in Vienna, but I had a grandmother in Budapest that I visited very often, and after she died, I just kept going. And in Hungary, much earlier than in Austria, there was there still is an open competition for curatorial concepts for Venice. And Katalin Timár, who is a curator at Ludwig Museum in Budapest, came up with this idea to propose my project that I had already started to the Hungarian pavilion. And somehow they struggled, but we were selected, we were sent to Venice. And I thought it was already, it was a progressive thing to do.
Yeah.
It was not the first time that the foreigner represented a country in Venice. In '93, for example, it was, Hans Hake and Namjoon Paigway in the German pavilion, which was, and in the Austrian pavilion, Gerwald Rockenschaub asked his colleagues Andreas Frieze and Christian Philipp Müller to exhibit with him. But that was in '93. So it's still, this national representation means an artist from that country, and then.
Yeah, and we're back at that.
Yeah, it's still
very much so.
Going very strong. These ideas of local scenes and of national scenes is still very strong. So I felt it is a big relief that I'm not representing the country of which I'm 100% a part, but I can do this as an outsider. And also with a project that probably somebody who is much closer and who is part of that place could not have done in that way. Because of course I'm also clueless about many things. And I think this in-between, being in between is always good. It's not always easy, growing up between cultures, even if they are neighboring cultures like Austria and Hungary, you're still an outsider. I'm a migrant. This is an identity I claim, and it's very important. But I'm not exotic. I'm interested in something that is not very well known to me because that's boring, and I'm not interested in the exotic because that's sensationalist and exploitative and boring,
and pretty much colonial, which we both are trying not to be.
So I like these situations where you have a lot. You can also the statements you're giving, they are not essentialists. They are case studies. They are vague ideas. They are
maybe models again. To use that term being established for your practice a lot.
And when I talk about a place that is not my own, I talk about my own experience. And hopefully the viewers, the people who see my work, they can relate this to their own experiences. When I show the logos of Vienna, I hope whoever sees this think about, how is the place where I live representing itself? Am I a part of this representation? Does this image or this idea, this touristic idea or this national idea, does this include me? Does this include others? Does this exclude others? So all these things are shown or brought up in this very abstract way, and in this very superficial way. All my works are also about surfaces. I try to dig deep into the surfaces.
Yeah. Also, you did in your exhibition that you had at MUMOK Vienna at the MUMOK Gallery, titled 2008.
Yeah, which was in 2008, I guess. That's when we met.
Around the time we met there, exactly.
It was 1 year after the Venice Biennale, and it was in a way a continuation, but I don't think many people saw that. But I was again looking at two different places of culture. One was the auto show, the Mondial de l'Automobile in Paris, which is the yearly big event of car manufacturers to present their products. Things that are cars, that are engineering and design and space. And what I was interested in back then was also the aspect of how design is tied to a certain time, because car design was invented, like design as a term in car production, to create a new model that makes the old model look old.
Yeah, creating obsolescence, we love that now.
the role of design, not engineering, in creating obsolescence. So and that's also why the exhibition was called 2008, and it was in 2008. So I was photographing the at this auto fair, focusing not so much on the cars but on the architecture that surrounds it, the display elements, the walls, the surfaces, the temporary architecture. So topics that are very persistent in my work. I do exhibitions too. I was looking at a very high-profile exhibition to look at how they do things. I didn't take these photographs to be exhibited. I took them as a research for my sculptural practice. Yeah. But then, out of the hundreds of photos I took, I chose some for this exhibition. And there was another series of photographs on the opposite wall from a place in Los Angeles called Pacific Design Center, which sounds very grand and super interesting.
I've never been. I always thought it was grand and super interesting. But
what it basically, it's a big building. It's a landmark building by Cesar Pelli.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of shopping mall for interior designers. So you just have shops that sell, sofas and rugs and lamps and stuff like that, but not to the public, but to the trade. And the building itself, as I said, it's a landmark building. So there's this aspect of it, sitting in the landscape of Los Angeles. And again, there are all these displays and presentations and exhibitions. And I was focusing, on the space and on surfaces, on details, and I haven't looked at those photos for a while, but I think it would be interesting seeing my current work to look at.
Indeed, I have looked at the two books that you have made accompanying the exhibition just recently during lockdown when I cleaned up my shelf. And they still hold up, and also now revisiting our conversation about places of culture and cultural production and representation, I think it fits very much into it, saying that also an automobile show or interior design shopping center are kind of places of representation of our culture. It's part of our culture. Yeah. And needless to say, for those who don't know, you are also kind of an expert on vintage cars somehow. And I think this is also interesting, to tie in not only like high arts or like high culture, but also pop culture and the idea of, what's a car fair about? How do we perceive that? Which kind of design is involved there? I think it's really interesting, actually.
I just remember an encounter, the reason why I could take photographs in Los Angeles was because I had the Schindler residency from the MUMOK. And I remembered now that you said that later I revisited Los Angeles and I met with the artists who were there at the time, and we were out eating something, and next to us, a contemporary supercar, sports car stopped, and it had a blue iridescent color and of course a very spectacular shape, and the artist I was with, she wasn't interested because of course cars, they're boring. But to this day I remember this, and I think something is odd about an artist who is not interested in color and shape, even if it comes in the form of a car.
As it is, part of our culture. It's a nice story. You had also this exhibition where we re-invite previous residents of our Schindler residency to come back after a few years and make a two-person exhibition at the garage top at the Mackie Apartments. And you did that together with Oscar Tuazon. What was that show dealing with, actually?
Well, I invited Oscar because his work is extremely different from mine, but I think we share a lot of interests. And, built environment and the possibility to engage yourself with building that environment. And he also does a lot of research on historic architecture and the role of architecture in society. And he's a sculptor, which is much more obvious than with my work. And the work I showed there was also related to an art fair, not to an art fair, but to a high Frieze, but to a car fair.
Quite obviously, that's what you like.
To the Detroit International Motor Show.
Okay.
Where I went because I really wanted to go to Detroit. Of course, it's a dream of many people who are into cities and architecture. And I photographed there during the show, but actually mostly during the dismantling of the show. So when these really elaborate, very expensive temporary architectures are being taken down. And maybe this is kind of full circle, and we will be able to end here soon, that, you know, building is about destroying. There's no architecture, there's no
nothing
construction
forever.
without...
Not even Vienna, as they claim in the tourist spots.
Actually, the new that's why Vienna Tourism changed the logo and their whole corporate identity, is because they realized that people think, I can always go to Vienna, I don't have to go now.
Oh.
So Vienna had to reinvent itself as a place where you have to go now because, you know, it will be different in 5 years.
Well.
So this was the big shift in the tourism communication.
Please still keep coming, people, you know, Vienna is fantastic. We tear down buildings all the time, and so that Andreas FOGARASI gets to make new work out of them. Maybe that's a good point to end this. Many, many thanks for viewing, if you did so, and thank you for having me over for this very, very interesting talk, Andreas.
Thank you, Marlies. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.